We're going to go ahead and get started. I know that some people are still kind of finding their way to Hall, but hopefully they'll be able to join in the discussion as they arrive. So before we kind of get started, Lena and I were talking about, we really don't know who the audience is here. And so if you could kind of let us know, how many of you are faculty? How many are grad students? How many are undergrads? How many are staff? And how many from Ivan Allen? Ooh, from engineering? Science? Architecture? Business? Other?
Okay.
All right.
Found our audience.
Awesome. Are there any other questions that we want to answer before we get going?
I think that's good.
All right. Great. So I'm going to start. Lena and I met a few weeks ago to talk about what we wanted to do with this particular event. We've actually been in conversation a lot about a lot of different things, but not so much actually about our work. So this is actually an interesting opportunity to do some of that. And when we had this conversation a couple weeks ago, we realized that one of the things that we're both really interested in is how culture becomes embodied. And in my terms, I kind of think about that in terms of how social inequality becomes embodied. So there's a slight difference here, right, in the way that it's phrased, although I often consider myself a cultural studies type scholar. You want to look at this?
You want to tell them what we're going to do?
Oh, yeah. No,
So
sure.
Anne's going to talk about her work, and then I will talk about some ideas that stem out of my work. I'm not studying it directly, and hopefully I think we're going to grab some lunch, and then hopefully engage in a conversation with everyone about these ideas in general, okay?
Exactly. Yes.
This is all food for thought. We'll try and keep it short, mostly to sort of tell you about what kinds of things we think about and to stimulate questions in your mind and discussion. So it's not like a formal kind of lecture. I'll see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. So keeping it informal and hopefully as fodder for discussion. Thank you to Carol for organizing this, and I think that the kind of framework is an interesting one of trying to think about how can we have interdisciplinary conversations toward collaboration, but even just toward understanding what it is that, as Lena said, we are thinking about, because I think that we don't always know. So one thing that I think a lot about is social inequality. I'm interested in it both as a researcher and as an activist, someone who's really trying to think about, okay, how do we characterize the world in which we live? And how do we mobilize to change it? And in order, one of the, a lot of the kind of issues of social inequality that I'm interested in are kind of standard vectors, so around race, gender, sexuality, disability, and more. And, but today I want to kind of focus on one of the key aspects of my work, and branch out to a couple of other topics, which is on race. So the particular question of how racial inequality becomes embodied is one that I've been interested in a long time. In some ways, since I was an undergrad, when I found myself annoyed with this question. I took a class in Nature, Nurture, and Public Policy. And what the kind of upshot of the class was race is not biological, it's social. This was like the moral of the story. But I found this really frustrating because all humans are social and biological all the way down at the same time. And I was also frustrated with this way of framing the question because I thought that, well, often what happens when you say that, okay, race is not biological, it's social, that becomes a way of understanding it as not real. And saying somehow that, okay, race is not real, it's just a social construct, and so how do we keep a whole process of this real, lived, embodied social inequality besides this kind of framework? I even think that the kind of framework that says, what portion is social and what portion is biological and trying to do percentages and stuff, I mean, that remains just as problematic because you're not 90% social and 10% biological or vice versa or 50-50 or anything, right? Throughout our bodies, we are the whole, we are social and biological all the way down. So one way that I kind of became interested in thinking about moving beyond this kind of social science framing was in terms of heart disease, because heart disease, I think, is this really compelling case where it's obvious that this question is not going to do the work that we want it to do. So we know that heart disease is social. We know that heart disease, so if we look historically, if we look geographically, we can see changes in patterns. So we know that society shapes our risk for heart disease. But we also know that heart disease is biological. So it's just incontrovertible that problems with our hearts can make us sick and can make us die. So I think that this became why I became so interested in thinking about race and medicine in terms of heart disease. Because a lot of cultural studies of medicine really focuses on peripheral aspects of medicine. So whether it is mental illness or whether it is reproductive technology, those are kind of dominant fields within the cultural studies of medicine. And a problem with that is that on the one hand, there's always these kind of boring arguments about whether mental illness is real. And then at the same time, there are ideas that, okay, reproduction belongs outside medicine. And so heart disease is a chance to say, okay, well, here's a topic that is real, exists inside medicine, and brings together the social and the biological. So I wasn't interested in framing the question this way, but I am really interested in how the social and biological come together. Central organizing kind of question of my work is about how do people tell stories using medical technology and disease categories. So how do they tell stories about identity and difference? And my first and so far only book is about the history and cultural studies of race and heart disease over the 20th century. And so what this work does is looks at how various folks have talked about heart disease from the founding of cardiology in between World War I and II until the commercial failure of a drug called Bidil, which if folks are interested in, I can talk more about the pharmaceutical aspects there. But it became really clear in my kind of historical research about the founding of cardiology that early cardiologists understood that biology and society both shaped how early cardiologists understood what they were doing. They understood heart disease as necessarily a white disease because they thought, okay, well, this is a disease of modernity. It's what happens after infection is brought under control. It's what happens when we lead sedentary lives that are stressful and we plan for the future and we have ambition. And so for that reason, the real lived experience of the biology of African Americans was largely invisible. So you would find situations where people were dying of indigestion, right? Like, so the diagnosis was indigestion. So I'm going to guess that that actually marks something like coronary artery disease, since it's not technically speaking possible to die of indigestion, although maybe it feels like it sometimes. But I think, so I don't actually make a claim about the data. I analyze the people who are analyzing the data, right? So this is kind of a second order science. But I'm also interested, because as I mentioned, I'm interested in these stories questions, I'm also interested in other actors. So both physicians and how physicians and medical researchers talk about identity and difference through their work, and also mobilize for social change, so advocating for care for their patients. And then I'm also interested in broader public actors. So, in the book I talk about everybody from Oprah to Henry Louis Gates Jr. to kind of articles in popular newspapers and so on. Because I think that these are all part of how we can understand how race and medicine come together. In heart disease in my instance, but I think it's extrapolatable more broadly. So over the 20th century, it's clear that heart disease has been democratized in the sense that now we know that everybody can get heart disease, so of all races, of all genders. And this has been partly a result of social justice movements. So people fought to be recognized as the appropriate objects and subjects of medicine, so both to be the appropriate patients and the appropriate physicians for addressing this really serious problem. And I think that this is part of why I also find this kind of topic so interesting, because heart disease research then becomes really high stakes, and it also has a social justice element. So now African Americans are considered to be particularly at risk. So we have an inversion of what had been the case in the early 20th century. And there's lots of reasons why. And I am really interested in this question about etiological ambiguity, which is a little bit of a mouthful. But so etiology meaning just like what is the cause of the complaint, and then but the ambiguity that these things can't be quite decided. So on this slide, you can just see a bunch of reasons that are given for why it is that African Americans are at increased risk for heart disease. So one is money, obviously. So we know that race and wealth are highly correlated in our society. And of course, relatedly, but not exactly the same, health insurance, right? So access to health insurance. Another issue is about drug response. And this graph actually is a little bit misleading because there's less gray area than there should be. But there is like a lot of discussions within epidemiology and within kind of blood pressure medicine about differential drug response. So that if you look at a population-wide level, you'll see most people overlap in drug response, but you do see population-based differences. So maybe this contributes to these unequal outcomes in terms of why African Americans are at particular risk for heart disease. Another issue is unequal treatment. This was a report that the picture is from a report that came out from the Institute of Medicine documenting the systematic racism that patients receive in care. So even if they've got the money, and even if they've got the health insurance, and even if they know what drug they need, they're systematically often not given it. Genetics, of course, is also often given as a reason. I don't find that very convincing just because of the overlap of genetics between populations so much, exceeding the differences. But moving down, the thing on the left, right, is blood pressure. And blood pressure was one of the big themes that has come up in conversations about race and heart disease throughout. But blood pressure itself has this really complex history. So blood pressure itself is related to things like salt intake, which of course is related to things like density of fast food in your community, is related to things like whether you're preparing your food at home or not. And then particular drugs, so access to drugs. There are really good, cheap drugs available for hypertension, so including hydrochlorothiazide, which this is a picture of, but they're not always accessed. They're not always appropriate. There are side effects. There are lots of issues that happen there. And then, of course, the broader racism in society. When you hear, you can even hear people say, kind of casually, right, talking about pressure being up. That's got my pressure up. And I think especially these weeks, as we're really aware of the high risk of systemic violence directed at African Americans, it's hard to imagine that that doesn't have a physiological element, right? So when you're living in a racist society, that, of course, increases tension and hypertension. So I'll leave this map thing for the moment, but if folks are interested, I can talk about these broader ancestry arguments. But what I found, so both in the historical research and then on through today, was that race was a durable preoccupation in medicine. So what I mean by this is a little bit of a psychoanalytic vibe for folks who are familiar with that kind of literature, but that I'm interested in these kind of twin notions in race and heart disease. So race is a durable category because it's not just any of these, it's actually the accumulated insults of these. So it never quite works to replace race as a risk factor with something else, like eating at McDonald's or like money. But then at the same time, it is also a preoccupation. So it can't be let go of because we need it in order to make advocacy for social change. So, right now in epidemiological studies, which I also look at, race is obliged to be included, right? So racial categorizations are obliged to be included if you want funding from the federal government. And so it can't be let go of for that reason, right? So it becomes like this thing that you can't escape. And for me, I don't know that I even want to escape it because I'm really interested in making kind of claims for a change. So I don't see necessarily any kind of biological claims as being like what is and will always be, but there are claims that we can then use to mobilize for change. So I think that heart disease is this really good opportunity to see how it is that inequality becomes embodied. So I don't look at the pathophysiology of it directly, but I am very interested in how it matters. Now, some of you may be noticing, right, that I'm talking about race here as one vector of difference. Of course, there are others, most notably gender is one of the ones that comes up the most in heart disease research. And so my book touches on, but does not focus on it, but of course it's relevant, and I am interested in this. I did do one little side project about Betty Friedan and heart disease. She is an interesting character. So for folks who don't know, she's an important early feminist, wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and which was a huge kind of influencer of the second wave of feminism. And she, throughout her life, had weird things to say about heart disease. So including talking about her own experience in her family. Her father had heart disease. And then also, toward the end of her life, talking about how, oh, you know, heart disease in men is something that can be good for women because the fact that men die earlier means that women can flourish in old age. So there's like some interesting stuff going on here, right? But for her, the differential incidence in heart mortality, in heart disease mortality, was evidence that women were living better lives at the end of the 20th century than men were. So she did not use this as some kind of like notion of genetics or kind of pathophysiology in some kind of narrow sense, but for her, like heart disease is symptomatic of you're not living a balanced life. And there's a lot more, obviously, that you could say with that. But moving on from heart disease, I mean, there's a lot else that I'm interested in. One of the things that I'm interested in my most recent work is about mass incarceration and the impact of mass incarceration on embodied inequality. So prison creates this strange situation in the United States where the only people with a constitutional right to health care are prisoners, and yet the care that they receive is woefully inadequate. So prison then both kind of creates an opportunity to access healthcare and also contributes to embodied inequalities. And so another thing that I've been working on recently, so this is an Advance Online kind of publication, is about the Scott sisters case, which for those of you who are not familiar, this was a case from a couple of years ago where two women who were sisters, who were serving double life in prison for a trivial crime, were released conditional upon the governor of Mississippi put a condition on the release that one sister would donate a kidney to the other. So this has not happened, actually. Neither sister is healthy enough to give or receive a kidney. But I think that these kinds of examples become ways that you can see this aspect of prison as both contributing to embodied inequality and then also becoming this site. And it also becomes part of how social justice movements are articulated. So the case of these particular women was very mobilized in social justice communities, but then it also has fallen, I think, somewhat to the wayside since. So I'm going to close pretty soon, actually, but I want to talk about a couple of kind of broader conceptual points as we're thinking about liberal arts and how do liberal arts scholars engage with issues of science and technology. Of course, this one is much less scientific than the stuff about the history of cardiology. So there's a couple of key points that I think are worth thinking about. So one is a very conventional within literary studies kind of notion of bodies that matter. So this is the title of a book that Judith Butler wrote way back in the 1990s, arguing that bodies matter in two ways, right? So they both are stuff and they also carry meaning, right? So bodies are matter and they matter. So, this kind of discursive move highlights something important for me about the way that race and inequality operates. Even though I think that often Butler is used in a way that really is oblivious to physiology, and just kind of, so you say that the matter matters, but you never look at the matter, much less advocate for how the matter should change through something like access to pharmaceuticals. So I also am interested in this kind of other element of it, of the material semiotic, which is an even more jargony term, but from Donna Haraway. But I think that this is a really kind of key way that I think about race. It's a key way that I think about pharmaceuticals, I think about gender. And and it's a really key notion in science and technology studies, which is my area, which also captures this simultaneity of matter and meaning. So our bodies themselves are material semiotic, and one of the reasons that I find pharmaceuticals in particular such a rich area of inquiry is that they're an easy case for the material semiotic. Like, it's not hard for me to convince my students that pharmaceuticals both change your body and carry meaning. They both are symbolic and material. And so heart disease, too, is both material and semiotic, as is even something as high stakes as mass incarceration. And so is race and gender. So I guess what I want to leave you with here is that, thinking back to that opening question about is race biological or social, and how frustrating that to me, is that social inequality is not innate, but really not much of import is. And as our bodies develop in our social worlds, they're shaped by it. So everything in culture becomes embodied, including race and inequality. So I'll leave it there as our lunch comes in. Or is that lunch, Jocelyn?
It's on its way.
It's on its way. All right. So I'll hand it off to you, Lena.
So I'll just start by saying this is not my typical audience. I have a short talk that I gave several years ago where some of these slides are from, thinking about how to think about culture, cognition, movement, and how the brain works. So my research, I'm in biomedical engineering, and my research really focuses on human movement and how that happens. And it's a complex system, and early in my career I studied mechanical engineering, and I was very interested in the structure of the body and how it should move to do things like walk and run and things like that. And it seemed like a very objective type of study where we would study forces, we would study structure, and we would sort of determine how it is that people can do the types of motor tasks, very elegant motor tasks that we can do that robots can't do, right? And as I tried that very sort of objective study, I realized that we couldn't figure everything out just by knowing the mechanics of the body, and then I started studying the nervous system and how that's controlled, how that sends impulses to the body to move, and still yet I was unable to find the answer of how do we move, how are we supposed to move. And I admittedly came from a very engineering approach and a perspective that I still see a lot in physical therapy and in medicine of we're going to measure X, Y, and Z, and it's going to be the right way. And things are moving along to the point where that's not really the way that I think we should be thinking about how people move their bodies, how they control their bodies, and so that's expanded sort of my view. Now, I would love to find out if any of you are interested in working on some of these issues with me, but I'm really interested in how it all happens, and these interactions between the body, the brain, and the environment, both physical, and I know that it extends to things like social and cultural types of interaction. So let me give you a little bit of background. If you just go from a neuroscience perspective, we know that a chicken walks without its head, and so that there is some sort of very basic automatic circuitry that controls walking, and there's this idea in neuroscience that just produces the movement. Now, on the opposite end, I actually started in a field where I thought that the mechanics should control everything. Let me see if I can get these to go. Actually, where if someone could hit the button, whoops, no. If you click on the movie, oh, you know what? I don't know if I updated that movie, so that's going to make this talk very difficult to give. If you go backwards one slide, click on the left. So this is just a bunch of metal going down a slope, and it is a passive dynamic walker. And so what it shows is that there is much about how we move that's actually encoded in sort of the structure of the body. Could you click on the second slide too? And so people who like mechanics say, oh, we're going to answer, how to make all these robots work and whatever, how people walk by studying the mechanics. But the important thing is that the neuroscience side sort of doesn't consider the mechanics. And here we have an object that has no control, no muscles, no motors, and it's doing this thing that looks very, very human-like. Now, of course, if you push on it, it falls over. And so this is very interaction of the two that works. And I was talking to a very prominent researcher in the field, Andy Ruina, who builds these types of things. And he said, Lena, you're studying the wrong thing. The neural control of walking is really not that interesting because I can come up with 1,000 different controllers that will make this thing walk. And what's really difficult is understanding the mechanics. And I said, that's just because it's really hard for you to get your machine to actually do that. I mean, there's 1,000 tries before you actually get it just balanced to do that. And so he said, the control was trivial and therefore not interesting. And at which point I said, Andy, look, if you were walking across the quad, I can tell it's you. Something unique about the way that you walk that I can see from far away. And if your evil doppelganger came and had the same mechanics and everything, I would probably be able to tell that was not you. And at which point he said, I'm going to show you something that's going to change your life. But that's because he's sort of dramatic. And he actually showed me the next video, which I'm not actually sure if I loaded up properly because this was a talk, but it's from Karen Liu, who's actually in College of Computing here. And it's a simulation. Let's see if these work. Otherwise, I'll pull it up at the end if it doesn't. But she does computer animation. But what she did is measure people walking in a happy style and a sad style. And so we know people look different. But she was able to put that into math and to generate walking patterns of this avatar that look happy or sad or looks like this individual, that individual. She could measure them in one activity and create a movement in the style of that person, which suggests that there's some physicalness to what that style is. And these are probably very subtle changes in the way that people hold their posture, control their muscles, and coordinate themselves. So I don't think if we click on that one it's going to work, but we could try. Oh, it might. No, I think it's probably... oh, it is. Okay. So the interesting thing about this is that she didn't record this exact motion. She recorded somebody just walking and then said, here, carry a briefcase. What's it going to look like? And so this is just one person, happy, sad, or neutral, but you can apply the same principles to studying someone who has a different kind of gait. And this is came home to me because, I was born in the States, my parents are from China, and after college I went on my, journey around the world to find myself, and so I went to China and I did not blend in at all. People, exactly that thing happened. They saw me from across the way. I don't walk like all of you, and I just didn't move at all like the people there, and they could spot it instantly. So how do I now think about how that happens and why that happens? That brings me to this idea that we have these accents in our movement, much like we have accents in our speech that are dependent on the environment that we grow up in, and typically those are culturally influenced by the language that you learn at an early age. So this slide probably has a bunch of complex stuff that we don't really need to talk about, but of how I think about, what your body's trying to do is to perform, and that's defined in various ways. We usually just use sort of energetic criteria, but there's lots of other reasons that we move. We move to communicate with people, to interact, to show our social status, or it either intentionally or unintentionally. There's a lot of things about ourselves that come out in how we move, and so one of the ideas is that in the brain, your brain does a categorization. So when you have lots of different objects, we generate categories of dogs and cats and trees and chairs and things like that. So philosophers like to talk about this stuff a lot. But I think it's been thought about as, oh, this is the wrong button. Okay, let me go back. Mostly people think about categorization and stuff as a cognitive process, and so, but I think that it's actually just a basic neural process of how your brain works and how it deals with the environment. So let me give you an example from something you may be a little bit more familiar with, which is speech accents, right? So you can tell if somebody's from France or Japan or Africa or whatever, usually when they're speaking, particularly when they're speaking a foreign language, and it really demonstrates how that person's brain operates in a fundamentally different way. Now, there are common principles, but so for the science and engineering people, if you measure just the acoustic waves coming out of my mouth when I speak, I can do what's called a Fourier decomposition. I get some numbers, and I can plot the frequency, the primary frequency and the secondary frequency of that sound. So the first one's here and the second one's here. And these are a bunch of different vowel sounds, and you'll see that there's no objective sort of sound spot there that corresponds with an A or an A or a O, and that there's a lot of variability and overlap amongst different speakers of different gender, different cultures, and so, but somehow our brains parse this out. We're able to hear that. And so, interestingly, you can take the first frequency and the second frequency, and you could objectively find 22 different vowel sounds that are out there in the world. But each language uses a much smaller subset of that. So here's the breakdown of vowel sounds across different languages. So Swedish has like 14. English has, I think, about 8, and Japanese has 5. And so what happens is that this space gets, because we don't need to hear or produce 22 different phoneme sounds, our brains actually just throw away the information. Okay, so then it like compresses all of that space down to these into these useful vowel sounds. So it has to be, you have to experience it at a young age, and it has to be relevant to your ability to communicate. And so what happens is that this sound over here will be indistinguishable in meaning from a sound that's over here in this box, right? Objectively, we could measure that there's a difference, but when you cross the boundary, so these two sounds that are very close here actually have different utility in my communication, and that's all fine and good, but it really fundamentally affects what we hear. So I hope to convince you of that. And so what happens is that instead of being like a very linear, evenly spaced space, the differences between, let's say, this frequency combination and this one is really great because it matters in my culture, and between this one and this one is maybe not so great. But perceptually, what's going to happen is that these two are going to sound really far off. So if I go and my engineer, this is why it didn't work, I'm going to measure these things, it's going to tell me everything. Really, all of these things are the same, and all of those things are the same, but nothing in the objective space is going to be able to let me know that. I have to know what the language is and where those boundaries are, and those are defined by the language and the culture. So, and this is why Japanese people don't hear the difference between ra and line. You think that they're just, why can't they hear it? I said it. They actually cannot hear the difference. There have been a number of experiments showing that. So you can, for us, it's very salient, and for them, you just won't hear the difference. So because nobody actually believes me when I say that, I have, you know what, I have sound. Is there sound? How many of you know this McGurk effect thing? Okay, so one of the things is that sound is important for what you hear, but vision is also important for what you hear. And I imagine there's a lot of other things that are important for how you actually perceive things. So in Italian or whatever, hand gestures, it doesn't just add to your experience. It actually generates the experience. So what I'm going to tell you is the sound is not the sound is not what you hear. You're not going to hear the sound that's played. It's not however many hertz. Your brain is going to create the experience that you have based on all of the relevant inputs, not just the sound. So, do you know if this will play? Okay, so everyone should close their eyes and listen to this person speaking and tell me what you hear. No, that's... you know what? I might have my sound muted, which would...
It's coming out of a computer, but not the speakers overhead.
I forgot that I had this. Should have checked it earlier.
It's in the back. Just maybe it's the Mac adapter. I don't know.
Oh, we know what we plug it in. Right here.
That will probably be.
There we go. Let's not blow everyone's ears out. Be careful. I'm sorry to throw this AV disaster on you in the middle of the talk.
I don't know what the issue is.
Okay. Should we play it out of my computer? We'll see if you guys can hear it. Okay, so you have to close your eyes. What did you guys hear? If you heard it, I'll play it again. Yeah, so you can try it again, but open your eyes, and then what we'll do is just afterwards, if you want to come up and try it, then we can do it. I'll play it one more time. So what happens? What I'm playing you is ba, the BA, and so when you close your eyes, you hear that. When you open your eyes, the video is actually a ga, a G sound, and your brain doesn't compute that, and so it makes up another sound that you hear. So I'm telling you, I can measure the frequency. I can tell you objectively that this is a ba sound, but you will not hear it. I've had a couple people where it doesn't work on them, and I think they had some vision problems at a young age. So, but you know, we think that our perception is very, very objective, and it's really not. And so there's lots of other influences that can alter what I say actually happened here. And it also tells you, like, if I hear the TV from a different room, it's actually harder to hear it. You might hear something different than if you're in the room looking at the image. And this is just to illustrate the power of this. It's not easy to break out of these accents that people have. And it affects not just how you say the word, but how you actually perceive the world and sound, something that we think of as being very, very objective. So I have no idea what time it is. Let me just say, so this suggests that our brains are sort of chunking things that are important to us into very discrete sort of bins that shape our experience, and this has a lot to do with sort of statistical learning and context relevance, and people have seen this in all kinds of psychological studies. And I would say all possible contextual cues are used. So I just showed you vision and hearing, but there's lots of other things. So the context, and when you hear something, the person who's speaking, how, you know, what their posture is, probably all changes that. And so again, perception is interpretation, and it's not necessarily objective. Now,
this idea is something, and I think applies to how we move as well, something even more basic that we don't think of as a cognitive level. And I'm not going to belabor it, but so this is a quote from Lakoff. He was talking about word categorization, but seemingly objective properties of the world are actually the result of our interactions as part of our physical and cultural environments given our bodies and our cognitive apparatus. And I would simply replace cognitive with also neural apparatus in general that's affecting things as basic as muscle contraction, neurons, and that alters your entire physiology. We know when we stand hunched, and there's lots of things that medical conditions that manifest in how we move, how we hold our posture. I study Parkinson's and stroke and all of that, and we know that there are feedback loops that affect your hormonal state, the function of your organs and things like that. So I've been really interested in whether, if we look instead of at commonalities of how people move, but at their differences, so why one person walks this way and the other person walks the other way, rather than trying to find some objective standard to understand those differences and what they mean. And for me, I'm interested in how maybe, thinking and moving are really the same type of process and subject to the same kinds of rules. I'm not going to go through all this. This is for a different talk. But in my lab, we study how people move. We put lots of sensors on them, and then we try and extract what are these categories of movement that people can generate. And very, very briefly, what we do is look at coordination of muscles across the body and try to find units of action that are repeatable across different movements. So just like phonemes are in speech, so different speech sounds, I construct them in different ways to speak. There are such units of movement, and that ultimately I would like to show that these are experience dependent and that there are cultural influences and that affects how we interact in the world. We just actually tested 20 pre-professional ballet dancers this summer. So that's one way where it's very controlled experience that we can show would actually change how they would interact with the world, not when they're dancing. And so I've done this kind of thing where we look at, I'm pointing the wrong way, patterns of muscle activity, and this was in cats, and I could find that amongst like 15 different muscles, I could find 4 patterns that would produce different movements in the world, forces in the world, and then across each animal, I would find that even though they're generating the same force, and they're controlling it, activating it in the same way to produce the same type of action, the actual muscles that we're using were very different. So there's some physics there. I have to activate my quads to stand up, but then there were lots of other muscles that were activated. For what purpose, we're not entirely sure. We're looking at that. Is it stability? Is it because I want to hold a certain posture? Is it because they were happy or scared? I don't know, but I think that some of these influences are going to be encoded in sort of the physical activation of muscles that represent, how I think it's important to move. So with that, I'm gonna stop and just say that I think these principles of, how we conduct ourselves, our body, and construct movement and speech are really important medically, but also very interesting in why we're different across cultures. So I want to look at Parkinson's and stroke, but it would be interesting to look at people. We already know that people of different social status walk differently, of different cultures walk differently, with people with different psychiatric disorders looks like manifest in movement. And again, that now integrates the whole physiological loop. So what supports muscle activity, your circulatory system, your respiratory system, all of those functions are interacting. Okay, I'll stop there. I guess we are open for discussion. Yeah. We're not really sure how this will work.
Or even just discussion, right? If you are doing research that's related to the kind of research that we talked about that you would like folks to know.
Chloe?
So, so my work, we look at muscle patterns and we use pattern recognition techniques to understand sort of the number of building blocks that you need to generate a movement, or the number that I use versus you. And so we have to measure people doing a lot of different things and then look for common persistent patterns. And then we test that over a number of different types of movement, so fast and slow and that kind of a thing. And it's actually a big field of neuroscience and neuromotor control. But you know, what was convincing to me was the simulations. So you have a model of the body, so it's just physics, and then you generate torques at the joints to make it walk, right? And so the way that those different styles were actually encoded in that animation was that they measured somebody walking and they looked at the patterns of torques generated about the joints, and then did, they called it preferences. So there was some weighting, some preferential ways in which those torques were generated that when you now say generate a different movement, but I prefer this pattern of torques, it would try to stick to that as close as possible. And then that would, is enough to generate sort of satisfy the gross physical constraints of standing up and gravity, but added enough variation in the resulting movement that it still, you know, quote unquote, looked like that person. And so when you go from muscles to torque, it's not such a big jump to see how that might go into, I have preferential patterns that I use encoded in my nervous system that allow me to extend my arm, but maybe not in exactly the same way that you do. Well, the Department of Defense is very interested in things like this, so in identifying individuals at risk for, you know, illicit activities by doing that. So I believe that things like that are actually happening, but more from a heuristic or does it work kind of view. So whereas I'm more interested in why does your brain do that? Which I think are different things. So it's one thing to say there is a difference, and the other thing is like, why is it there? How does it tell me about how my body works?
Yes.
Next question for Lena. Without being too reductive, so if I move a certain way, say as an American, will I always move that way? Or if I move to China, will I change? Is that
Well, I think our answer is right here. Would you like to
share?
Here.
No. Oh, I think I speak loud enough.
Okay.
I had shared with her just a few minutes ago that I'm native Japanese. I was born and raised in Okinawa. I came to the United States at 15. Then when I went back to Okinawa as a service member, and of course I had my family members there. One time one of my uncles was helping me go car shopping. We were walking together at car lots, and he looked at me and says, "You need to walk like, you know, Okinawans." I'm like, he said, "You walk too, too confident. Put your head down." And I'm like, I said, "Well, I'm not sad. I don't. But I put my head down a little bit. But he said, "You need to walk like us." And I thought, walk like you guys? I don't know. I didn't even know how to conform because I was watching. I was observing other women. I didn't think I was walking any different. But my uncle saw that I was walking differently, and I grew up there. Maybe I was always walking like that. I don't know. I don't know.
No, I think that there certainly, neural plasticity is a huge buzzword now, but it basically means that neurons change as a function of our environment. But we know that there are critical periods early on in which we are much more influenced by our environment and shaping things. And so it's an amount of time, duration that you're spending that will shape how strongly those things are encoded. And so And that's how things like cognitive bias come up, where, you know, I have a model of the world, and then I live here forever. I graduate from college, I go to Europe, and like I make all the same mistakes that every other American tourist is is going to make. But then if I, you know, live there for a while, I may change the way that I make my decisions and the way that I move.
Well, and presumably also with individuals, there's so much variability too, right? So some individuals can learn a new accent very well, and other individuals really struggle.
But you make a cognitive decision, right? You took it for an time or something, said, okay, you need to change. This is how they're saying. You're very conscientious about that. So there is that brain and.
Well, right. So we can do that. I'm not sure that we actually, when we're children, that's probably not how it works. In children, you have all these inputs, and you're just sorting out which ones actually matter. Like, you know, if two sounds, it may sound different actually to a child. So infants can hear all 22 of these vowels that we can no longer hear. But over experience, they know that those two sounds mean the same thing, and they fuse. So then that's harder to break out of, but obviously they're actors who train a lot of hours and who pay attention to that, who do that. But for most of us, you have an accent, and they still understood me. So I don't have any motivation to actually change that representation unless it becomes really important, like you get laughed at school or something like that. But if it has to have enough of a cost to me that I want to consciously change it. Martha?
So at the beginning of your talk, just brilliant, but you drew a line between the brain and then the body environment. I guess that's really the other question is the head of the chicken and who walks ahead. How much is in the body do you think is the brain or is it just not even?
So it's both. So actually, I'm just got introduced. Well, starting this book called The Extended Mind, where there's an argument that your brain doesn't stop at the boundaries of your body, which I very much believe that we are the products of all of the interactions of the environment, the body, and the brain. And so what actually emerges from us is sort of indistinguishable from all of those things. We happen to have a forebrain and self-awareness that allows us to think a lot about those things, but there's a ton of computation that happens in the body. So if you look at the passive walking robots, right, that movement of walking is really, it's not in my brain. And if I go to Mars, it's different because gravity changes, and you can actually see that happening. But the astronauts on the moon struggle a little bit with their gaits, and eventually they hop because that's a better way to move. Yeah.
And you talked about advocacy and public justice. I'm just wondering if you could talk about some applications that have come out of your work, or how you've taken what you found in your research and tried to promote change. And in that vein, looking at how you do that with your work, or how you prevent someone from, let's say you develop something that can differentiate between different races by walking, like what we're talking about with surveillance, and so how would you prevent the government group or using that to profile or something like that?
Well, I think, so one issue is around advocacy around healthcare. So we know that a lot of what makes us sick is way before we enter the healthcare system. But I think, but one basic thing, right, is to really talk about access to pharmaceuticals and how those are mediated. And so things like advocating for Medicaid expansion, I think. So we don't have Medicaid expansion in Georgia, as people may know. And this actually has a huge impact on these kinds of differentials, because the longer that, and a lot of single adults, right, don't have access then to healthcare in this recognized way, and don't have access to these treatments and so on that you get. So there are actually like social policy type changes that you can talk about in terms of these. But I think that more broadly, it's kind of a way of illustrating the importance of the broader social changes as well. So that the neighborhood segregation that we have is making us sick, And some people don't care about justice, but they do care about illness. Like there's actually a lot of literature about, that illness claims can be stronger claims in court and in a lot of different ways. A claim that something injured me physically is, in some cases, a more compelling claim than that it was wrong. And so I think that those, finding ways to mobilize those illness claims, which, I mean, I do, but in my, tiny way, other actors who are involved in this kind of space. So the National Medical Association, Association of Black Cardiologists, other groups, really do articulate this, in these kinds of ways. Lena?
Well, I think the question you asked me is just a general question of how we categorize people, how we stereotype people, and how we use that information. And so we know, and this is also coming into medicine, that on an individual basis, not all of those quote-unquote rules or stereotypes are going to hold. And so there's much, I think there is a shift into looking at like multifactorial influences on disease and factors about individuals, and the recognition that there's no absolute prediction. But I don't know that you could say that on average there isn't some difference that you could pull out. But in terms of accuracy on an individual by individual profiling issue, you're still going to have lots of false positives. And
Wait, so you mean the changes of physiology, how they impact the environment, or how they are impacted by the environment? Yeah, I mean, so in the best studied aspect is cortisol. So, so these kind of hormones that we know are, impact the body in a really systemic way. And so, chronically elevated cortisol levels and also inflammatory response. Those are two of the clearest things that have been studied. I mean, I don't do that research myself. To say, okay, I'm going to get these people into groups by socioeconomic status and by race and by these other things, and then measure, whether it's inflammatory response or cortisol. But that certainly is an area of a lot of study, and it's very convincing. I mean, there are very, there's very, so again, not at an individual level, right? You can't use it as a diagnostic, okay, I'm going to measure your response, and then I'll be able to tell what group you're a part of. But on a population-wide level, we absolutely can see that. And I think that, and then there's a lot of things that are kind of done about that. So one is, so some people try to do kind of psychotherapeutic approaches, which is always problematic, right? Because it's do you want people to adjust to an unjust society? If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention, I think, especially these weeks. So, I mean, I think that there is, that is a double-edged sword, but on the side of the individual, I think that can be very useful, right? So for self-preservation, finding some tranquility is something that is both kind of the clinical mode and then also potentially, an important aspect of human well-being.
yeah, so on an individual basis, I think there are ways that people can alter that physiology, maybe not cancel it out. There's studies, I know, people look at various practices that individuals can engage in, massage and yoga and things like that, but I don't know that it would be dangerous to say that would negate any environmental, effects on that individual. Hopefully ameliorate it some, but that would be.
Yeah, in a way, I think it's similar to pharmaceuticals, right? I mean, so pharmaceuticals are also like a late stage intervention, right? So you're looking at, trying to deal with a system that is already out of whack, and you're doing it through pharmaceuticals or through a surgical intervention or something else, right? Which is important because we care about that individual, but we also need to focus on some of the root things too. Yeah.
I'm not sure how much data is out there for it, but have you seen evidence of in situations where quality has improved, that health improves in concert with that, and the particular methods of more justifying better health impacts than other approaches?
Yeah, there's especially in the heart disease space, the most robust literature about this is coming out of the UK. And so they look at societies that became more equal and less equal after World War II. And you absolutely see that happen, right? So some of the highest incidence now of heart disease is in the former Soviet Union, where you have just this also of course, turmoil is bad too, right, in general. So, kind of major disruptions in ways of life is also harmful. But then, so you see situations like where the former Soviet Union, you have this radical increase, and then in the Nordic countries, that's not the case, right? And in the UK, a lot of people are really interested in, and I think the UK case is really interesting to me because they actually study social class, which doesn't have this vibe of genetic in the same way that race does. So, but they look at a lot of these things about if you, so how social class impacts your risk. And then also then, so as things change, right, in a post-industrial era, what impact that has on populations, especially in the north of the UK who have been impacted by that. So, I think that it is often it's hard to see those things over the course of a life because something like heart disease is the accumulated insults over the lifespan, so you can't do the same kind of thing that, I feel like in Lena's thing when you're have the person standing on an uneven thing, you can induce it and you can measure it and you're good, right? And you can do that with cortisol levels and you can do that with certain things, but what we really want to know, we can't quite do that. So they do it epidemiologically rather than on an individual level in order to approach that.
I don't know if there was a component of that question for me or not. I will say, so there's a study that we are doing where we have people with Parkinson's with balance impairments, and my collaborator, Madeline Hackney, has developed the adapted tango rehabilitation intervention. And so it does improve people's motor responses, their balance, and their walking. But there's a lot of other things that it improves at the same time. And so it just shows that there's a lot of linkages between the two. And so we're now measuring sort of emotional state and balance, confidence, and some cognitive measures to see how those are all related. And just anecdotally, people are standing up straighter and they look better. But unfortunately, Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disease, and so we're always, if people stay the same, that's better. But anecdotally, there's a whole body type of change that's induced, even if we're just targeting, this balance mechanism.
Yeah.
There may have been, maybe in a more psychology type of way. It really depends on the field of the investigators studying the field. So so there are different factions, and whether it gets integrated or not, it really depends. So the people in the neuroscience field being reductionist would then focus on that matter. People interested in the muscles would be reductionist and focus on that matter. The most integration, and I'm not remembering the names, but
probably about a century ago, in some of the psychology literature, we were talking about communication and gesture being as important as sound and that kind of a thing has been there. And again, this book, Extended Mind, it may be coming back to that now, where people are recognizing all of these multifactorial influences, but it's still very much the case that when I talk to neuroscientists, they don't care about the body. And vice versa, when I talk to biomechanists, they're like, we're just going to figure this out and it's going to work. But they're starting to realize that it's not working, and they have to interface at least those two elements right now to figure out, to make individual predictions of how people will move. So if you're interested in what's called predictive medicine, which means that I look at you as an individual, then I have to get beyond generality. And so I have to look at something that's very specific to you, and it turns out that getting closer to that is when you put both of those things together. And ultimately, what I think is getting even closer, we have to factor in all of these other factors that we're not even beginning to talk about.
Yeah, and I definitely think that there's, in cardiovascular medicine, certainly, there's a lot of interest in how there's that you can't do the kind of mind changing that you want to do without interacting with the body and vice versa, right? So it's like, there's these interventions for women who are profoundly sedentary, right? So who walk less than 150 paces per day. And how, you can't deal with someone like that in a way that is only about the biomechanics, but you also can't do it without dealing with biomechanics. When you're in that situation, you're going to have to intervene on the level of the body. It's not going to be enough to give a pep talk to someone and try to, and get them a shuttle bus to a neighborhood that's safe enough for them to walk in, or whatever it is, right? So I think that this is where a lot of the most interesting therapeutic medicine is looking at how how your thoughts about the world as it is and as you would like your individual world to be interact with how you're moving in the world and what you're eating and whatever, everything. My guess is that it's part of the broader epigenetic turn. So, the kind of the frustration with the Human Genome Project, we found all the letters and now we still don't know what's happening. And then, and that a sense that, and this is, of course, in the field of race and medicine, race and science is so overwhelmingly a question about genetics. So then the epigenetic turn in the life sciences then influences that disproportionately. But I think that this idea that okay, we don't need to know just what the code is, we need to know how it's expressed. And you can't do that by just looking at the code. You have to look at it in an organism. And the organism is existing in an environment. So I think that it's part of that broader trend beyond the code.
But also, certainly there's a huge economic impact of people who simply get sick from obesity, which is a function of their environment, and a number of other things. And so, agencies like the CDC are interested in things like this now. And in general, we see that economic impact, and when you see that, then stuff happens.
Yeah, totally. What question? Yeah. Well, I don't know. I really advocate more for well-being than health in any kind of narrow sense. It's not about just maximizing the number of active work years or something like that. That's not my model, right? And so, it's important to have space for joy too, and all of those other things that are not necessarily going to be on your health indicator. So, But I don't think that it's, but I also don't think that it's an either or. I mean, there are, you can find ways to both kind of express yourself and experience the physical well-being.